Today, we step into one of the most intriguing and least understood mysteries in all of Tolkien's legendarium: the Blue Wizards. Almost everyone knows Gandalf. Many remember Saruman. Some can name Radagast. But Tolkien didn't send 3 wizards to Middle-earth. He sent 5, and 2 of them arrived, turned east, and disappeared so completely from the story that they became little more than a rumor at the edge of the world. That alone would be enough to make them fascinating. But what makes them truly extraordinary is that Tolkien himself never gave a single clean answer about what became of them. In one version, they seem to fail. In another, written late in his life, they may have done some of the most important work of the entire Third Age. That contradiction is not a flaw. It is the heart of the mystery, because the Blue Wizards force us to confront a question Tolkien's mythology rarely states openly. What if some of the greatest work in Middle-earth was done far from the places where the story was looking? So let us go back to the beginning, not merely to the War of the Ring, not even to the Third Age, but to the deeper foundations of Tolkien's world. Because before the Blue Wizards were old men in blue robes, they were something far greater. Before the robes, before the East, before the story. The beings later known as the Wizards were originally Maer, immortal spirits of great power who existed before the shaping of the world. In Tolkien's cosmology, the first beings created by Eru Iluvatar were the Aenir. These were vast spiritual intelligences, brought into existence before time as the children of the world would understand it. They took part in the great music of creation, and from that music came the themes that became the history of Arda itself. The greatest among the Aenir became the Vala, the powers of the world. Beneath them were the Maer, lesser than the Vala, but still far beyond mortals in wisdom, power, and nature. The 5 wizards were chosen from among these Maer and sent into Middle-earth as the Istari. But they were not sent in glory. They did not arrive as blazing beings of light. They were not meant to appear as angelic powers in full majesty. They came in the shape of old men, deliberately aged, deliberately limited, deliberately clothed in weakness. That choice mattered. If they had come as they truly were, they would have inspired awe, dependence, and submission. But that was not their mission. They were not sent to dominate the peoples of Middle-earth, not even for good reasons. They were sent to guide, to counsel, to awaken courage, and to help the peoples of the world resist evil by drawing on their own strength. The task was not to replace free will with divine control. Their task was to encourage freedom from within. So they came diminished. They could grow tired. They could hunger. They could suffer. They could feel the burden of being clothed in flesh. Their bodies were not just disguises. They were limits. And among those 5, 3 became central to the story we know. Gandalf, once called Olorin, was the wisest of the Maer. He had walked unseen in Valinor, strengthening hearts, stirring hope, and bringing courage to the weary. He learned pity and compassion in the House of Nienna, and that capacity for sorrow without despair shaped everything he would later become. Saruman, originally Kirumo, came from the people of All, the smith and maker. He was brilliant, orderly, skilled in craft, lore, and power. He was chosen to lead the Istari. That choice made sense on paper and proved disastrous in practice. The very qualities that made him gifted also made him proud. He could not endure the idea of not being central. Radagast, or Iwendil, was bound to Yavanna, lover of growing things. He loved birds, beasts, forests, and wildlife with genuine devotion. But Tolkien suggests that this love became, in its own way, a distraction. He cared for the natural world so deeply that he lost sight of the peoples he had been sent to help. These 3 left visible marks on the narrative. But the other 2 are different. They arrive. They stand at the Grey Havens. And then they turn away from the lands the story follows. They walk east. The 2 in blue. Picture the moment. It is the year 1000 of the Third Age. A ship comes to the Grey Havens from the Blessed Realm. 5 figures disembark onto the grey shore, carrying no armies, no crowns, no open signs of divinity. Only staffs, robes, age, and purpose. 4 of them will eventually become known, remembered, debated, sung about. 2 will not. The 2 in blue leave the havens and keep walking. They pass beyond Rivendell, beyond the misty mountains, beyond the lands where Tolkien's great narrative takes place. They move into the vast east and south of Middle-earth, territories that sit on the map like silence, places associated mostly with the source of Sauron's armies. And then the story loses sight of them. For most of Tolkien's life, that was more or less the whole situation. He mentioned them, he named them, he sent them east. Then he turned his attention elsewhere. But late in life, Tolkien returned to them. And once he did, the question became impossible to avoid. What were they doing out there all that time? The answers he began to sketch were not simple, and they were not consistent. But they reveal something profound, not only about the Blue Wizards, but about Tolkien's entire mythology. Because their story is not about a battle. It is about work that cannot easily be seen. Work that may not be recognized. Work whose results appear only in the shape of history, not in the spotlight of narrative. And that makes it one of the most Tolkienian mysteries of all. Who were they really? Tolkien is less specific about the pre-incarnate identity of the Blue Wizards than he is about Gandalf or Saruman. But he gives us one crucial clue. They were associated with Orome. That matters enormously. Orome is the great hunter among the Vala, the rider who moved through the dark and wild places of Middle-earth long before the Western lands were fully known. He was not a power of courts and towers, but of open distances, shadowed roads, and unknown regions. Most importantly, he knew the East, not by rumor, not from maps, but by having ridden through it himself. So if the Blue Wizards came from Orome's people, then their assignment was not random. They were suited for distance, for strangeness, for lands beyond the familiar reach of Elvish memory and Númenórean order. They were prepared, in temperament and in calling, for the unexplored and the difficult. In earlier writings, Tolkien names them Alatar and Palando. But in much later texts, he gives them different names, Marinatar and Romastamo. And those later names are deeply revealing. Marinatar means Darkness Slayer. Romastamo means East Helper. These are not merely names. They are functions. Tolkien, late in life, seems to have stopped thinking of them merely as two mysterious individuals and started thinking of them in terms of what they were sent to do. One to strike against darkness. One to help the East. That shift is significant. It suggests that Tolkien's understanding of their mission had sharpened. These were no longer loose ends. They had become purposeful. There is another important detail. Alatar volunteered. Tolkien says this directly, and then Orome asked that Palando go with him. Unlike the other wizards, who mostly worked alone, the Blue Wizards were sent as a pair. That was probably no accident, because what they were being sent into may have been the hardest mission of all. The East was not empty. The East of Middle-earth is often treated by readers as empty space, a vague background region beyond the main action. It was nothing of the sort. By the Third Age, the East had already lived under the long shadow of Sauron for generations upon generations. In fact, Sauron's influence there reached back into the Second Age. While the Western story remembers him as Anatar, deceiver of the elves of a region, that was only one face he wore. In the East, Sauron did something even more disturbing. He built worlds. He shaped cultures. He formed loyalties. He offered power, meaning, order, and theology. He taught people how to understand authority, divinity, and strength. That means the Eastern peoples were not simply soldiers who happened to march in Sauron's armies. They were communities shaped by long ideological domination. Their myths, hierarchies, and inherited assumptions had been bent around his presence. This point deeply troubled Tolkien himself. He did not like the idea that the peoples of Run and Harad should be read as inherently evil. In letters, he explicitly suggested that they too were victims. People misled for generations, people raised inside systems of falsehood powerful enough to look like truth. There is a brief but unforgettable moment in The Two Towers where Sam sees a dead Southron and wonders who he was, where he came from, and whether he truly wanted to be there. That moment matters, because Tolkien wanted us to see what the story often cannot linger on. The enemy armies are made of people, and that makes the Blue Wizards' mission morally enormous. They were not sent east to conquer strangers. They were sent east to help peoples already trapped inside Sauron's version of reality. Not people who had never heard of him, people who had heard almost nothing else. The mission's cruel difficulty. The Istari were under strict limits. They were not allowed to dominate. They were not allowed to answer Sauron's tyranny with a nobler tyranny. They were not allowed to seize control, dazzle nations, or turn themselves into divine rulers. Their task was to help without replacing, to inspire without controlling, to awaken strength rather than making others dependent on theirs. That is already difficult. In the West, at least, there were traditions older than Sauron's shadow, elvish memory, Númenórean wisdom, long habits of resistance. Gandalf could work with people who still possessed fragments of an older truth. But in the East, the challenge was far worse. Their people had been shaped to expect power in one form: lordship, mastery, sacred authority, domination. If a mysterious ancient being arrived among them, wise and powerful and unlike any ordinary mortal, there was already a slot for that figure in their imagination. It was not humble guide. It was holy power. That is the tension that lies at the center of Tolkien's two conflicting versions of the Blue Wizard's fate. The dark reading, they failed. In a famous response to a reader, Tolkien suggested that the Blue Wizards may have failed. Not dramatically like Saruman, not by openly betraying their mission or building industrialized evil. Their failure, if it happened, was quieter and sadder. Tolkien thought they may have founded cults and secret magical traditions in the East, religious movements that grew around their presence, their powers, and their mystery. In other words, they may have become objects of reverence rather than teachers who pointed beyond themselves. That distinction matters. The failure here is not evil in the obvious sense. It is the failure of method. Imagine how it could happen. You arrive among peoples who know only one spiritual pattern. Powerful being appears, demonstrates wonder, becomes center of devotion. You do not want worship. You do not demand obedience. But the people around you interpret you through the only categories they have. They gather. They elevate. They attach meaning to your presence. They build community around you. At first, perhaps this seems harmless, even useful. A gathering gives structure. Respect creates listening. Reverence makes the teaching stick. But slowly, something changes. The people begin to depend on you, not on the truth you came to help them rediscover. The community becomes centered on the teacher rather than the teaching. The moment that happens, freedom begins to weaken. This is the failure Tolkien seems to fear. Not corruption into evil, but transformation into the wrong kind of good. A helper becomes a holy figure. A guide becomes a center. A mission to build capacity becomes a structure of dependence. And in Tolkien's framework, that is no small error. It reproduces the shape of the very problem the Istari were sent to solve. The hopeful reading, they saved the West from afar. But Tolkien did not stop there. Late in life, he revisited the Blue Wizards and offered a far more hopeful possibility. In that later view, the Blue Wizards did not merely wander east and lose themselves in failed cults. Instead, they played a crucial role in Sauron's eventual defeat. Not a minor role, not a symbolic one, crucial one. Tolkien suggests that they stirred resistance in the East and South, encouraging rebellion, preserving independent traditions, and preventing Sauron from fully uniting all the peoples under his command. That idea is explosive once you think it through. Because if Sauron had been able to mobilize the full strength of the East and South, the West would almost certainly have been crushed. The defense of Minas Tirith was already desperate. The War of the Ring was balanced on a knife edge. If the forces marching under Sauron's banner had been even greater, the outcome could have changed entirely. So why didn't everything march? In Tolkien's late vision, part of the answer may be this: because two forgotten wizards spent 2,000 years making sure it couldn't. They worked not through visible conquest, but through disruption. Not through overpowering force, but through patient resistance. Not by creating empires, but by preventing one empire from becoming total. That is a very different kind of heroism. No dramatic showdown. No single battle. No crown. No songs. Just centuries of undermining darkness from within. Failure and success may both be true. The most interesting possibility is that Tolkien's two versions do not entirely cancel each other out. One may describe their method, the other their effect. Perhaps they did become objects of veneration in some places. Perhaps their mission became entangled in unhealthy devotion. Perhaps they never fully escaped the spiritual grammar of the world they were trying to heal. And yet, even so, perhaps they still weakened Sauron. This is entirely possible in Tolkien's moral world. A flawed movement can still preserve truth. A compromised community can still resist something worse. An imperfect servant can still accomplish real good. If so, then the Blue Wizards become one of Tolkien's most mature ideas. Good working through damaged forms, partial failures still producing essential victories, imperfect faithfulness leaving behind real hope. That feels less like legend and more like history, and perhaps that is why their story resists neat resolution. 2,000 years of invisible work. What the Blue Wizards were doing cannot be told like an adventure. A quest has a beginning, middle, and end. A battle has a climax. A king's return is visible. But what does 2,000 years of patient cultural resistance look like? It looks like generations rising and passing. Communities forming, being crushed, and forming again. Traditions surviving in fragments. Questions whispered in private. Old lies losing their inevitability. Alternative memories being kept alive long enough to matter. This kind of work has no dramatic center. Its victory is cumulative. And that may be exactly why Tolkien could never narrate it properly in the style of The Lord of the Rings. The Blue Wizards' work belongs to a kind of history that epics depend on, but rarely have space to show. Their contribution may be measured only in absences. The army that never arrived. The rebellion that tied down troops. The province that refused loyalty. The people who remembered there was another way to live. That may not make for a triumphant chapter title, but it can change the fate of the world. Why they had to go together. Perhaps the most moving thing about the Blue Wizards is not merely that they went east. It is that they went together. Every other wizard is defined largely by their relationship to those they serve. Gandalf's deepest bonds are with elves, men, and hobbits. Radagast turns toward birds and beasts. Saruman increasingly orients himself toward systems and control. But the Blue Wizards' deepest and most enduring relationship may have been with one another. That matters more than it first appears, because 2,000 years of obscure labor would be unbearable in solitude. No songs, no recognition, no assurance that what you are doing is working, no clear proof that history will ever remember you. To carry that alone would be spiritually brutal. But to carry it with one being who truly knows what you are, who remembers Valinor, who understands the mission, who has seen the same losses, the same tiny victories, the same centuries of slow effort, that changes everything. One can steady the other. One can see what the other misses. One can say, keep going. Tolkien understood companionship at a profound level. Again and again, his deepest strength lies not in the isolated hero but in the pair, the friendship, the shared burden. Frodo has Sam. Merry has Pippin. Legolas has Gimli. And east of the map, the Blue Wizards had each other. That may have been the reason they endured. Why their story never closes. The canonical story of The Lord of the Rings ends beautifully because it can end. The ring is destroyed. The king returns. The Shire is saved. The ships sail west. But the Blue Wizard story is not the kind of story that ends in one visible act. The liberation of a people from a false worldview is not a single event. It is a process. It is uneven, fragile, reversible, and never truly finished. You do not throw ideological darkness into a fire and watch it vanish forever. You resist it. You weaken it. You outlast it. You replace it slowly with better ways of seeing. That means the Blue Wizards' work may have continued long after Sauron fell. In Tolkien's late thought, they may not even have sailed west with the others. Gandalf's task in the west had been fulfilled. The east was different. There, the collapse of Sauron would not instantly heal everything he had shaped. The people would still need help. The old structures would still leave scars. The work would still remain. And so somewhere, far beyond the places the story follows, two old figures in faded blue may still have been walking, teaching, preserving, dismantling, rebuilding. Still there. What the blue wizards ultimately mean. The blue wizards are not just an interesting piece of lore. They may be the purest test of what the Istari were actually sent to do. Gandalf's mission is dramatic because the story follows him. But Gandalf may be the exceptional case, not the standard one. Most of the Istari mission was probably not made of speeches before kings or confrontations with Balrogs. It was likely slower, quieter, more deeply embedded in ordinary history. The blue wizards show us that. They represent the kind of work that does not become legend because it does not fit easily into legend. Work that matters because it is sustained. Work that changes the world without ever becoming the center of the narrative. And perhaps that is Tolkien's final, beautiful point. The story is not the whole world. There are people beyond the page. There are deeds beyond the chronicle. There are struggles the main tale cannot follow. And silence in the record is not the same thing as absence in reality. The blue wizards walked east. Maybe they failed in part. Maybe they succeeded more than anyone knew. Maybe they founded flawed communities. Maybe they kept whole peoples from falling completely into shadow. Maybe they helped preserve the margin by which the West survived. But whatever the exact shape of their fate, Tolkien's late thought insists on one thing. They were there, present, patient, necessary, unseen but not unimportant. Marinatar and Romastamo, Darkness Slayer and East Helper. Two figures in blue robes crossing beyond the edge of the known story, doing work the story itself could not contain. And maybe that is why they remain so haunting, because they remind us that the greatest acts are not always the ones history knows how to name.